I'm just gonna say it, there's no good tutorial out there on how to use linear camera profiles in Lightroom, and today I'm going to change that. But before I can do this, I first have to talk about what linear camera profiles are, how to make a linear camera profile for your camera, and then finally I can show you how to integrate it in your Lightroom workflow to get better colors and even better film emulation in your edits. So first of all, linear camera profiles are camera profiles as the name implies, but they don't come with a pre-baked gamma curve, and that means that whenever we're importing our photos and applying a linear camera profiles, the image is gonna look really flat because we're seeing the actual data in the file. But the truth is that linear camera profiles get a bit of a bad reputation because people believe that you're getting more dynamic range out of your images, and that's not really true. Although, as you just saw, I got back some of the details in my sky without touching the highlight slider. And that's because our cameras don't actually capture images in the way we see them, they capture data, and on top of that data they have to apply a camera profile with a gamma curve in order to get a preview that looks similar to what we saw in real life. And whenever we import our photos in Lightroom, it does the same thing. Lightroom applies the camera profile on the data in order for us to get a nice preview and a photo that's actually readable by a human and pleasant looking. And that's why we have Adobe Color, Adobe Neutral, Adobe Standard, and even camera matching profiles that you would believe that are similar to what you get in your camera, but they're actually an approximation from Adobe based on how photos usually look from your specific camera. And this is not that bad if you wanna do some basic editing where you just recover some highlights, maybe increase the details in your shadows, and then apply a preset to get some type of film look. But at the same time, because of the gamma curve that's applied in our camera profiles, we're getting highlights that are much harder to recover than our shadows. You can imagine this as editing a raw file where somebody already increased the highlights in your photos and then you're trying to recover them. It would be a much easier time if you wouldn't have to fight that. And at the same time, because of the gamma curve, we also have to deal with our colors being just a bit messed up. And that's because the gamma curve works in a similar way to our S-curves. And that's something that I talked about in a previous video, but very briefly, whenever you apply a hard S-curve to your photos, you're also messing up with the saturation of the image, and you can see this when I'm toggling this S-curve on the photo on and off, where the greens in the background got a lot more saturated after applying my S-curve. So for people like me who likes to heavily edit their photos, it's much better to not have to fight that gamma curve and be able to edit the data in the raw files directly. And that's exactly where linear camera profiles come in handy. But before I can show you how I integrate them in my workflow, let's very briefly talk on how to create one from scratch. First, you'll have to go to this website and download the DNG profile editor from Adobe. And in this app, you have to go to File, Open DNG Image, and select one of your DNG files. But if you don't work with your photos as DNG files, you can use Lightroom to convert one of your RAW files by clicking this button right here. And after opening the DNG file, all you have to do is go to the Tone Curve tab and select from this drop down Linear. And as you can see, the photo is already much flatter, and I can go to File, Export, and export the profile just like that. And to import the profile that we just created in Lightroom, we go to the camera profile, we click on these 4 squares, and right here we have a plus where we can import the file that we just created. And after doing that and restarting Lightroom, we can finally talk about how to use linear profiles in our edits to get the most out of our files. And I'm gonna start with this photo, which was purposely shot underexposed so I could protect the highlights behind the film and I wouldn't have too much stuff that's blowing out. And I'm gonna go directly to my linear camera profile, and we can see that I dropped a ton of contrast and the photo looks even more underexposed. But because of that, I can now push the exposure in the photo quite significantly, even up to 1.2 stops. And my highlights still look really good because I don't have that gamma curve applied on it, and my highlights are not getting crushed in that upper part of the gamma curve. And when this is done, I can just apply a new luminance range mask. I just pressed Shift Q there as a shortcut, and I have to click on this luminance range to enable it. And now I can make my own gamma curve where I don't boost the highlights as much, but I can pull down my shadows and get a custom curve that looks something like this. And just like that, I can now do all my editing in the normal panels over here, do my color grade, even apply some film simulation like my color response curves. Let's say maybe for this photo something like Kodak Gold would work the best. Then go ahead and also apply some grain, and I already have a photo that looks really nice in just a few clicks without messing around even with the basic panel. So the workflow that I'm proposing for linear camera profile is not only providing me with a neutral starting point and a linear response from my data. I'm using a mask on top of my image that has a custom gamma curve, and this way all the color edits that I'm doing inside of my normal adjustments tab sits under that gamma curve, and I can get much better gradients and much better colors because of that. And for this photo, I'm gonna boost the shadows just a tiny bit, maybe the blacks as well, and I can also play around with the saturation or the vibrance and fine-tune the colors exactly how I want. But keep in mind that all the sliders that I'm playing with right now are affecting the actual data in the photo instead of applying it on top of the gamma curve that was applied in my camera profile normally. And this works so well because Lightroom applies the tone curve inside of a mask as a last step in the processing pipeline. So our custom gamma mask is gonna be applied after all of our other sliders. So even stuff like the color grading wheels are gonna be applied under our gamma mask and are going to be accentuated by it instead of them working against the gamma in the normal camera profile and be applied on top of that. So when I'm now pulling on the highlight slider, I'm actually affecting a much nicer gradient that haven't been pushed so hard on the upper parts of the spectrum. And just like that, I got the highlights to look warm and pleasant with a few clicks without affecting the skin tones too much, and the entire photo maintains a nice natural look. And that's a general thing that I noticed since I started using linear camera profiles. Because I'm not pushing the gamma curve so much, my photos don't look that crunchy anymore, and they don't have that HDR look even when I'm pushing high dynamic range situation, like in this photo, which is the perfect example of a high dynamic range. A sunset where I exposed for the highlight, protecting the sky from clipping, but because of that, I have little to no details in this part over here if I'm pushing my exposure up. So instead of doing that, I'm gonna switch to my linear camera profile, and now you can see that the contrast throughout the entire photo dropped significantly. But this also means that I lost a ton of exposure, and I'm gonna push my exposure up as much as I can without starting to clip. And that's another thing with our cameras, which are playing standard profiles by default. Because of that, we might actually be underexposing our photos a bit too much. So I would say if you plan to edit with a linear camera profile, it's safe to say that you have at least one more stop of exposure before the data is actually starting to clip. So welcome back to the technique of exposing to the right, which was much more popular when everybody was shooting film. But going back to my image, I'm gonna start by creating a new mask. I'm gonna use a linear gradient on the foreground over here where we have a bit too many details on the grass, and all I'm gonna do is use the tone curve to pull down on my midtones and just leave the shadows a bit to lose some details over here. And now let's press Shift Q and create our own gamma curve. I'm gonna start again by creating a nice highlight roll-off, and then I'm going to push my shadows down and play around with the pivot, because remember I wanted to have some details in the village over there. So I'm not pushing my shadows too low, but I'm also going to lift the black point just a tiny bit, so this photo has a bit more of a filmic curve. And I think right now is the right moment to apply a bit of grain, because I'm going for a film simulation this time. I'm going for all-in-one grain 800, and also let's combine that with some color response curve, probably something like Fujicolor 200 for a bit of a nostalgic feel. And all these things that you just saw me apply are tools that I created to emulate film in Lightroom. You can find them on my website, but on short, color response curves are a way to emulate the colors of film using just the red, green, and blue curve in the curve panel, and the all-in-one grain is a way to add grain to your photos using luminosity based masking, and this way you have various amounts of grain based on what's actually in the photo and not just a uniform overlay slapped on top of your images. And although my sky still looks rather bright and colorless over here, I can pull back the refine saturation slider and then add some saturation from the saturation slider globally, so my photo looks a lot more punchy. But I've done all that and I haven't even touched the basic adjustment, so I can also come in and recover some of my highlights if I want my sun and my sunset to look super warm. And while I do think that I pushed that photo a bit too far and it's a bit oversaturated now, I think it's still a good example of how much color you can get out of that flat looking linear camera profile. And while linear camera profiles do have this reputation for being super useful in high dynamic range situations, I want to show you a more neutral photo and how I work with it using linear camera profiles to get a really nice filmic feel and a nice film emulation. So this is the photo. Again, I shot it super underexposed, but that was my mistake. So I'm starting up with the exposure pushed up with 1.8 stops, and I'm going to jump directly into my linear camera profile where I'm going to create my gamma mask first, and we're gonna deal with everything later on. And because I know that I want to go for film emulation, I'm gonna start with quite a generous filmic shoulder over here, and again a really generous filmic toe on the bottom over here, but I'm also keeping a pivot that's pretty much to the left of the histogram because the photo was massively underexposed. And now let's go ahead and apply some grain. I'm gonna go for all-in-one grain 800, and again you can see the three masks that my grain presets are applying on the image so you don't get that flat looking grain. And let's also apply a color response curve. Let's go for a portrait film stock, maybe Kodak Portra 160 or the neutral color version. I like this one much more, and you can already see that I built myself a good first setup for a nice film emulation. And while I could probably just leave it there and still have a nice film emulation, let's take it a few steps further so you can see my entire workflow. And I'm gonna go directly to my HSL panel where I'm going to push my yellows back into oranges just a bit more, and I want to make my sky look a bit more cyan, and also increase the luminance in these tones over here in the grass, in the yellows, just a tiny bit more. And I'm going to go to the color grading tab and add a bit of cyan in my shadows, just a tiny bit, and also in my highlights, but add a bit of orange to counter that in my midtones. And honestly, I think that the oranges in this image are still a bit too punchy, so I'm gonna pull down the saturation in the calibration panel in the red primary while boosting it in the greens to accentuate all the grass and the sky behind of her. And of course, this is still a film emulation where I maintain a lot of the color and the punchiness of the film, but of course we can go back in Lightroom and create one more mask across the entire photo if you want to go for that faded look. And in here what I'm going to do is add one more filmy curve, which is gonna leave my blacks and lower my highlights just a tiny bit while maintaining the midtones pretty in line. But in this one I'm also going to reduce the refine saturation and even pull down the saturation of the entire photo a bit more to get more of that grungy filming look, which is probably well complemented if I also boost the roughness of my grain to make it look like the film was underexposed or at least badly exposed. But of course, all this film emulation stuff is down to personal preference. I enjoy it a lot and that's why I use it. But at the same time, you can use linear camera profiles to get clean looking photos that look modern without grain or film emulation. And while I'm pretty sure that you will not want to combine a linear camera profile with a custom curve inside of a mask for every single one of your photo for the stuff that you want to look super high-end, this method is gonna provide much smoother gradients and much better colors. So give it a try and let me know how it works for you in the comments down below. And also, if you feel like you'd want a one-on-one workshop with me discussing how to edit your specific photos, use the contact form on my website and we can schedule something up. Oh, and don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button on your way out if you enjoyed this video and you feel like you learned something new today. Bye!